The snow came down like a judgment. Each flake melted on Helen Carter's eyelashes as she stumbled down the main street of a town that had already condemned her. She pulled her thin shawl tighter, but it was soaked through, clinging to her like a second skin made of ice and shame. Her boots couldn't find purchase in the frozen mud. Every step felt like she was trespassing on her own life. Lanterns cast a warm, mocking glow from the saloon and the mercantile. It was a warmth she couldn't have. She could feel the eyes watching from behind the glass, their whispers crawling under her skin. There's the widow, pretty but useless now. Her husband, Samuel, was in the ground. And in this town, a woman's beauty didn't buy bread. It only bought contempt. The weight of their stares bent her more than the wind. She reached the porch of the general store, her breath a ragged cloud, her fingers numb. She steadied herself on a wooden post, trying to stand against the tide of voices that echoed in her memory. It wasn't just the cold that made her tremble, it was the endless rejection. A group of townsfolk crunched toward her through the snow. Martha Bell, her lips a thin line of satisfaction, made sure her voice carried. There she is, back to beg again. Shame clings to her like that ragged shawl. Laughter followed, sharp and cruel. Helen ducked her head, her cheeks burning. She whispered to no one, to everyone, "I ain't worth much." Then the saloon doors swung open. The laughter died in their throats. A man filled the doorway, tall and broad, his bare chest steaming in the frigid air. It was Nakai Redhawk, the Apache warrior the town hated and feared. He stepped out like the cold was nothing, his dark hair falling loose over his shoulders. Silence fell over the street. The world held its breath. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes found Helen, only her. The world tilted, her knees gave out, but before she could hit the ground, he moved, fast as a shadow. His hand, large and warm, caught her arm. He lifted her like she weighed nothing at all. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, a widow in the arms of a savage. But pressed against him, all Helen felt was the shocking heat of his body, the steady, solid beat of his heart. "Put her down, Red Hawk!" Sheriff Amos Harlan shouted, but his voice was weak, uncertain. Nakai ignored him. He bent down, wrapped her own pathetic shawl around her with a strange gentleness, and then lifted her fully into his arms. The whispers turned to outrage, words like stones, a disgrace. She flinched, turning her face into his chest. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't. I'm not worth the trouble." He stopped walking. The snow fell heavier, gathering on his shoulders like a mantle. He tilted his head, his gaze meeting hers with the stillness of an ancient mountain. His voice was deep, and it vibrated through her bones. "You're worth everything to me." The words hit her harder than any blow. It wasn't a confession of love. It was a statement of fact, a truth carved out of the storm. For years, she had been measured and found wanting. Now, this man, this outcast, was telling her she was everything. The crowd muttered, their certainty shaken. Sheriff Harlan didn't know whether to draw his gun or run. Martha Bell's mouth just hung open. Helen closed her eyes, clinging to him not out of choice, but out of a desperate, terrifying need. He started walking again, carrying her away from the lights of the town, away from their judgment. The voices faded behind them, swallowed by the swirling snow. Her body was heavy with exhaustion, her heart too raw to question him. Why? Why would he say that? His silence was an answer she couldn't yet understand. Against her cheek, his skin was a furnace. Against her despair, his presence was a shield. She drifted into a haze, the world reduced to the sound of his footsteps and the rhythm of his heart. His words echoed in the empty space where her shame had lived for so long. "You're worth everything to me." She didn't believe him. She couldn't. But as the snow buried their tracks, erasing the path back to the world that had cast her out, a tiny crack appeared in the ice around her heart. When she woke, she knew she'd be in his cabin. The town's fury would be pounding at the door. But for now, for this one moment, she was safe. And in the silence between his heartbeats, she wondered if he was right. She wondered if the man who carried her was not a savage, but a savior. But she was wrong. He was neither. He was something far more dangerous. He was a collector of debts. The cabin was small, nestled into a snowdrift, as if it were hiding from the world. Nakai kicked the door shut behind them, the sound echoing in the sudden warmth. A fire on the hearth cast flickering shadows on the walls, illuminating bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The air smelled of sage and smoke and something wild. He set her down gently on a thick fur pelt by the fire. It felt like an offering. Her body was racked with shivers, but a deeper tremor of shame went through her. "I shouldn't be here," she rasped, trying to stand. Her legs buckled instantly. He steadied her with a hand on her shoulder, his silence a wall against her own self-loathing. He moved across the small room, poured steaming water from a pot into a wooden cup, and pressed it into her hands. The simple warmth of it was more intimate than any touch she'd known. It undid her. "I have nothing to give you in return," she whispered, hating the weakness in her voice. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, dark and unreadable. Then he turned, sat on a stool, and began mending a strip of rawhide with a sharp knife. The message was clear. He expected no payment. But that was a lie. The storm howled outside, sealing them in. Hours passed in a quiet rhythm. He added wood to the fire. He placed bread and dried meat within her reach. He draped a heavy coat made of wolf fur across her shoulders when her shivering started again. Each act was a silent thread, weaving a strange connection between them. She found herself picking up one of his moccasins, noticing a small tear, and stitching it closed with a needle from her pocket. The familiar motion soothed her, even as the intimacy of it made her pride ache. The world outside, however, was not content to leave them in peace. On the second day, a sharp knock rattled the door like a gunshot. Nakai opened it to find Sheriff Harlan, his beard crusted with ice. "She can't stay here, Red Hawk," the sheriff said, his eyes darting past Nakai to where Helen stood by the fire. "You know what they're saying. It ain't right." "I'm just resting," Helen said quickly, desperate to shield him from more trouble. "I'll be gone soon." The sheriff's expression softened for a half-second, then hardened back into a mask of duty. "The town won't forgive this. A decent woman in an Apache's cabin. There'll be no place left for you." Nakai just closed the door, cutting off the sheriff's muttered threats. Helen pressed her hands to her face. "You see? I ruin everything. I'll only bring you trouble." He crouched by the fire, his gaze steady. He didn't argue. He just placed another log on the flames, sending sparks spiraling up into the chimney. Storms were to be endured, not run from. His calm was infuriating. It was terrifying. It felt like the stillness before an earthquake. Later that night, the words spilled out of her before she could stop them. "Samuel died because of me," she murmured to the flickering flames. The name tasted like ash. "He went out for firewood in a blizzard. I told him not to go. But he wouldn't have gone if I hadn't complained about the cold." Her throat tightened. "A tree fell on him, broke him. I found him buried in the snow. And now there's nothing left of me worth saving." She waited for pity, for judgment. Instead, Nakai shifted. He pulled the collar of his tunic aside, revealing a latticework of raised white scars across his back and shoulder, old wounds from lashes and chains. The marks of a man who had been broken by the world and had somehow put himself back together. His silence said more than words ever could. "We are both ruined." A strange sense of belonging flickered inside her, but it was a fragile thing. The next morning, the snow stopped. Pale, sharp sunlight spilled across the landscape. Helen stood at the small window, watching the world glitter. Behind her, Nakai sharpened a knife, the sound of steel on stone a steady rhythmic pulse. She wanted to thank him, to tell him his silence had been the first peace she'd known in years. But another knock came, harder this time, more insistent. Nakai rose, his body blocking the doorway as he opened it. She couldn't see who was there, but she heard their voices, harsh, demanding. "Come back with us, Helen. It's not safe here." A widow's disgrace. Her heart seized. They hadn't come for him. They had come for her. She turned from the window, trembling, as the cold air swirled into the cabin around Nakai's imposing frame. His silence had been her shelter. But now, the world was here to tear it down, and she was about to find out that the townsfolk weren't the only ones who believed she belonged to them. Nakai did too, and his claim was far older and far more binding. The voices outside grew louder, sharper, cutting through the thick cabin walls. "Send her out, Red Hawk! This ain't her place!" Nakai stood like a rock in the doorway, the firelight catching the hard lines of his back. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just existed, a barrier between her and them. Helen crept closer, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't see the men, but she could feel their collective judgment, a cold, bitter wind. Sheriff Harlan's voice rose above the others, laced with a strained authority. "She's a widow of this town. She belongs with her own folk. You keep her here, and there will be a reckoning." The fire crackled, mirroring the frantic beat of her heart. Shame sealed her lips. They were right. She didn't belong here. She didn't belong anywhere. She closed her eyes, waiting for Nakai to step aside, to hand her back to them like lost property. Instead, he planted his feet wider. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a landslide. "She stays." A wave of shocked muttering rolled through the crowd. Helen's pulse hammered against her ribs. Martha Bell's shrill voice sliced through the air. "You'll ruin her! A decent woman wouldn't stay in there with him." Helen flinched. The words were a physical blow. A decent woman. The phrase echoed in her mind. Was she decent? Hiding here, protected by a man the world called a savage? Her shame was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. Then another voice spoke, this one calm and resonant, like the tolling of a distant bell. Elder Redbird, Nakai's uncle, had come. "A woman who has lost everything deserves shelter, not scorn," he said, his words cutting through the tension. "Her grief is not your property to claim." The crowd shifted, uneasy. The sheriff, however, was unmoved. "This ain't about grief, Elder. It's about order. The town will not stand for this." Nakai remained silent, snow gathering on his bare shoulders. His stillness was a weapon, more powerful than any threat. Helen felt it reaching for her, steadying her, but the fear was a knot in her stomach. What if they hurt him? What if his strength became his downfall, all because of her? She'd already lost one man to a storm. She couldn't lose another to this one. Finally, the sheriff motioned for the men to fall back, his face grim. "This isn't over," he promised, his voice a low growl. Nakai closed the door. The silence that fell inside the cabin was deafening. "I have to go," Helen whispered, her voice shaking. "Before they come back, before they destroy you." He crossed the room and stood before her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was overwhelming. His dark eyes held hers, and for the first time she saw something other than stoicism in them. She saw a flicker of possession. He reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and pulled something out. He pressed it into her hand. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. She gasped. Her fingers tightened around it. She recognized the carving style, the clumsy yet earnest knife strokes. "Samuel," she breathed. "My husband made this." She looked up at Nakai, her mind reeling. Where did you get this?" Nakai's expression was grim. "He gave it to me, the night he died." The world tilted on its axis. What? No! That's not possible! He died in the woods, during the storm. A tree! There was a storm, Nakai said, his voice low and dangerous. But it was not the storm that killed him. He came here, to my cabin. He was running from them. Helen stared at him, the wooden bird digging into her palm. Running? From who? The sheriff, Nakai said, and his men. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. He came to me for help. He made a bargain. His life for yours. He told me that if anything happened to him, I was to watch over you. To protect you. He paused, letting the words sink in. He owed me a debt, and now I am collecting. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't charity. This wasn't kindness. This was a transaction. She wasn't a guest in his cabin. She was property. She was the payment for a debt she never knew existed. Shame was replaced by a cold, sharp terror. She backed away from him, her hand flying to her throat. No. He didn't move to stop her. His eyes were like chips of obsidian. He knew they would come for you next. He knew you wouldn't be safe. Safe? She choked out, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. You think this is safe? She had to get out. She had to run. She turned and fumbled with the latch on the door, her fingers clumsy with panic. She had to get away from this man, away from this terrible bargain. She threw the door open, ready to plunge into the snow, into the storm, anywhere but here. She took one step out into the freezing air, and then the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed through the trees. The gunshot ripped through the silent, snow-filled night. Helen froze, 1 foot in the cabin, 1 foot in the wilderness, caught between two dangers she couldn't comprehend. Nakai was instantly behind her, a solid wall of heat and muscle, pulling her back inside and kicking the door shut. They're back, she whispered, her voice trembling. They never left, he corrected, his voice a low rumble. He moved to the window, peering through a small crack in the shutter. They were waiting for you to run. The horrifying realization dawned on her. The sheriff hadn't retreated. He'd set a trap, and she had almost walked right into it. The carved bird felt slick in her sweating palm. Samuel? Running from the sheriff? It made no sense. Sheriff Harlan had been Samuel's friend. He'd been the one to deliver the news of his death, his face a mask of sorrow. Had it all been a lie? Why? She asked, her voice barely audible. Why would the sheriff want to harm Samuel? Nakai turned from the window, his face grim in the firelight. Your husband found something in the hills, something they wanted. Found something? What? Before he could answer, another shot splintered the wood of the door, inches from her head. She screamed and dropped to the floor, crawling behind a sturdy wooden table. Nakai was already moving, grabbing a long-bladed knife from its sheath on the wall. He was calm, his movements fluid and economical, as if he'd been preparing for this moment his entire life. Voices shouted from the darkness outside. Send her out, Red Hawk! We know she's in there! This is your last chance! Helen's mind raced, trying to piece it all together. Samuel's bargain, the sheriff's lies, a hidden discovery in the hills. It was too much. Her entire world, the simple, tragic story of her husband's death, was shattering around her. Stay down, Nakai commanded, his eyes fixed on the door, and stay quiet. But she couldn't. A new feeling was rising up through the terror, something hot and unfamiliar. Anger. They had lied to her. They had mourned with her, their faces etched with false sympathy, while hiding a monstrous secret. They had let her believe she was to blame for Samuel's death, letting her drown in a sea of guilt and shame. The door shuddered under a heavy blow. They were using a log as a battering ram. Helen looked at the carved bird in her hand. Samuel had been a simple man, a carpenter. He wasn't a prospector. He wasn't a treasure hunter. What could he have possibly found that was worth killing for? Nakai moved to stand beside the door, the long knife held low at his side. He was a predator waiting for the trap to spring. The wood of the door began to splinter, cracking under the relentless assault. Helen's eyes darted around the small cabin. It was a trap, not just for her, but for him. They had him cornered. There was no way out. Then her gaze fell on the fireplace. The fire was roaring, spitting sparks. Above it, on the mantel, sat a small clay pot filled with some kind of oil or grease. An idea, desperate and reckless, sparked in her mind. She scrambled to the hearth, ignoring Nakai's sharp, questioning glance. She grabbed a thick cloth, soaked it in the flammable grease, and then, taking a deep breath, she picked up a burning piece of wood from the fire. The door crashed inwards, splintering off its hinges. 3 men spilled into the room, rifles raised. The sheriff stood behind them, his face a twisted mask of fury and desperation. "There she is!" he roared. "Get her!" But before they could take a step, Nakai moved. He was a blur of motion, a whirlwind of controlled violence. He disarmed the first man with a brutal efficiency, the man's wrist snapping with a sickening crack. The second man swung his rifle like a club, but Nakai ducked under the blow, the knife in his hand flashing upwards in a deadly arc. It was chaos. Gunshots exploded in the confined space, the sound deafening. Smoke filled the air, acrid and blinding. Helen saw the third man take aim at Nakai's back. There was no time to think. She lunged forward, the burning torch in her hand held high. She shoved it into the face of the man, aiming at Nakai. He screamed, dropping his rifle and stumbling back, his hands clawing at his smoking beard. The distraction was all Nakai needed. He dispatched the second man and turned to face the sheriff, who now stood alone, his pistol raised, his hand shaking. "It's over, Harlan," Nakai snarled, his chest heaving. "Not until I have what's mine," the sheriff spat, his eyes wild. He wasn't looking at Nakai, he was looking at Helen. "Give it to me, Helen. Give me the map." Helen stared at him, confused. "Map? What map? Don't play dumb!" he screamed. "The map your husband made. The map to the gold." Gold. Of course, it was always gold. Samuel had stumbled upon a gold claim, and these men had killed him for it. But she didn't have a map. Samuel had never mentioned a map. She shook her head, bewildered. "I don't know what you're talking about." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He took a step forward, his pistol aimed directly at her heart. "Liar. He would have told you. He would have given it to you." "He gave her nothing," Nakai said, stepping between them, shielding her with his body. The sheriff let out a crazed laugh. "Oh, he gave her something, all right. He gave her you, his watchdog. But you can't protect her forever." Suddenly, a new voice cut through the tension. "He is not the one who needs to protect her." Elder Redbird stood in the shattered doorway, his face serene. And he was not alone. Behind him stood a dozen Apache warriors, their faces grim, their weapons ready. The hunters had become the hunted. The sheriff's face went white with terror. He was trapped. But the old elder wasn't looking at the sheriff. He was looking at Helen, at the small wooden bird she still clutched in her hand. "Your husband was a clever man, Helen Carter," the elder said, his voice soft but clear. "He knew he could not trust a piece of paper. The map is not on paper. It is in your hand." Helen looked down at the carved bird. It was just a simple piece of wood. How could it be a map? She turned it over and over, her fingers searching for a hidden compartment, a secret inscription. There was nothing. Then she saw it. A tiny, almost invisible detail she had overlooked. On the underside of one wing, there was a series of small, precise notches, not random marks, a pattern, and on the other wing, a different set of notches. It wasn't a map to be read. It was a key. But a key to what? And as she stared at the strange markings, she realized the real twist wasn't that the sheriff had lied. The real twist was that Nakai had too. He knew exactly what this bird was, and the debt he was collecting wasn't just her safety. It was a share of the gold. Sheriff Harlan's eyes were wide with a dawning horror as he looked past Elder Redbird to the silent warriors assembled in the snow. He was a cornered rat, and he knew it. His bravado crumbled, replaced by a desperate, pleading tone. "Now, Elder," he stammered. "There's no need for this. This is a town matter, a misunderstanding." Elder Redbird simply smiled, a cold, knowing smile that promised no mercy. "Your time for misunderstandings is over, Sheriff. You have spilled blood on this land. Now the land demands a price." The sheriff's gaze darted around the room, from Nakai's cold fury to Helen's shocked face, and finally to the wooden bird in her hand. His greed momentarily overrode his fear. "That gold belongs to the town. He stole it!" he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Nakai. "He stole nothing," Helen said, her voice surprisingly steady. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture more terrible than she could have imagined. Samuel found it. It was his. "It was on my people's land," Nakai corrected, his voice low. He hadn't taken his eyes off the sheriff. "Your husband came to me. He offered a partnership, half for him, half for my people, in exchange for our protection from men like you." The final lie fell away. Nakai wasn't just a protector fulfilling a debt. He was a business partner, a stakeholder. He had his own claim on her husband's legacy. The realization should have felt like another betrayal, but it didn't. It felt right. It felt like justice. The sheriff made a desperate move. He lunged not at Nakai, but at Helen, trying to snatch the wooden bird from her hand. It was a fatal mistake. Nakai moved faster than she could track. He didn't use his knife. He simply slammed the sheriff against the wall with enough force to crack the timbers. The pistol flew from Harlan's hand, skittering across the floor. Before the sheriff could recover, 2 of the Apache warriors were on him, binding his hands with rawhide strips, their movements swift and practiced. The other 2 men from the posse, seeing their leader captured, threw down their weapons in surrender. The siege was over. Silence descended, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the ragged sound of breathing. Helen looked down at the bird in her hand, this small, innocent-looking object that had caused so much death and deceit. Elder Redbird stepped into the cabin. He walked past the captured men without a glance and stopped in front of Helen. His eyes were kind, but they held the ancient wisdom of the mountains. He gestured to the bird. "Your husband understood that wealth is not in the gold itself, but in the trust between honorable men. He chose his partner wisely." He then looked at Nakai, and a flicker of pride passed between the 2 men. The old man turned his attention back to Helen. "But the key is useless without the lock. Your husband was a carpenter. He thought in terms of wood and joinery. The map is only half of the puzzle." Helen's mind raced. The notches on the wings, they weren't directions. They were measurements, distances, angles. "It's a survey," she whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just marking a location, he was plotting a claim. "Indeed," the elder said, "but to what point of origin? A map needs a starting place." Helen thought back to her conversations with Samuel. He had been so happy in the weeks before his death, filled with a secret energy. He'd talked endlessly about a project he was working on, a special commission. He was building a new mantelpiece for the church. He'd been especially proud of the central carving, a symbol of the town's founding. "The church," she said, her voice filled with certainty. "The carving on the new church mantel." The elder nodded slowly. "The heart of the town's lies will reveal the location of its truth." It was a perfect, poetic justice. The town's most sacred building held the key to uncovering the crime committed by its most powerful man. The secret wasn't buried in the wilderness. It was hidden in plain sight, right in the center of their corrupt little world. But as this wave of triumph washed over her, she looked at the captured sheriff, his face a mask of spitting hatred. His eyes were locked on her. You think you've won? He hissed, his voice venomous. You think you can just walk into town and claim it? The whole town is in on it. They all got a piece of the action after we took care of your husband. They're not going to just let an Apache and his whore take what's theirs. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't just the sheriff. It was the whole town. The men who had tipped their hats to her on the street. The women who had offered her condolences. They were all complicit. They were all murderers. The offerings left on the path outside the cabin hadn't been gestures of respect. They had been payments of guilt, bribes to keep the ghost of her husband quiet. The cabin, which had felt like a shelter, suddenly felt like a cage again. She wasn't safe. They had won the battle, but the war against the town was just beginning. And she was standing right in the middle of it, holding the one thing that could get them all killed. The sheriff's words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The whole town. It wasn't just a few greedy men. It was a community built on a foundation of murder and lies. Helen looked from the sheriff's sneering face to Nakai's grim expression. They were surrounded, not by trees, but by an entire population of enemies. Elder Redbird seemed untroubled. A nest of snakes is still just a nest, he said calmly, and we know how to deal with snakes. He issued a series of quiet commands in his own language. The Apache warriors efficiently dragged Sheriff Harlan and his 2 captured men out into the snow. Their fate would be decided by Apache law, not the twisted justice of the town. When they were gone, the elder turned back to Helen. You must go now, to the church, before the town discovers what has happened here and hides the final piece of the puzzle. Go now. Helen felt a surge of panic. Walk into town alone? You will not be alone, Nakai said, his voice a low promise. He picked up his knife from the floor, wiping it clean on a rag. The thought of walking back down that street, facing those whispers, those eyes, was terrifying. But this time, it was different. She wasn't the broken widow begging for scraps. She was an avenger, armed with a terrible truth. The shame that had bent her was burning away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They left the cabin as the first hint of dawn was painting the eastern sky a bruised purple. The air was still and frigid. Nakai moved silently at her side, a phantom in the pre-dawn gloom. The snow-covered landscape was beautiful, but it felt menacing, every tree a potential hiding place for an ambush. As they neared the edge of town, the first signs of life appeared. Smoke curled from a chimney. A dog barked. The normal sounds of a town waking up, but to Helen, they sounded like a warning. They didn't go down the main street. Nakai led her through a series of back alleys and narrow gaps between buildings, moving with a familiarity that spoke of years spent watching this town from the shadows. They reached the back of the church just as the sun broke over the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. The back door was unlocked. They slipped inside, their footsteps echoing in the vast, silent space. The air was cold and smelled of old wood and incense. Stained glass windows threw muted jewels of color across the empty pews. It felt like a holy place, but Helen knew it was a tomb, a monument to a town's sin. The new mantelpiece stood over the main hearth, a massive piece of carved oak. It was Samuel's masterpiece. In the center was a detailed carving of a hawk landing on a mountain peak, the symbol of the town's founding. Helen approached it, her heart pounding. She ran her fingers over the familiar carvings, a fresh wave of grief washing over her. Samuel's hands had touched this wood. His skill, his love, was carved into every line. She pulled the small wooden bird from her pocket. It felt warm in her cold hand. What now? She whispered to Nakai. He didn't answer. He was scanning the church, his eyes missing nothing, his body coiled like a spring. Helen looked from the bird to the mantle. The bird was the key. The mantle was the lock. She examined the carving of the hawk on the mountain. It was beautiful, but it seemed solid, seamless. There were no keyholes, no hidden buttons. She remembered the notches on the bird's wings, measurements. She held the bird up to the carving. The length of one wing matched the distance from the hawk's eye to the tip of its beak. The other wing matched the height of the mountain peak. It wasn't a key to insert. It was a guide, a set of coordinates. Following the invisible lines dictated by the bird's wings, her fingers traced a path across the carving. At the point where the two lines intersected, near the base of the carved mountain, her finger pressed against a small, almost invisible knot in the wood. It clicked. A section of the mantle, cleverly disguised as part of the mountain's rock face, swung inwards, revealing a small, dark cavity. Her breath hitched. She reached inside, her fingers closing around a small oilskin pouch. She pulled it out. It was heavy. With trembling hands, she untied the string and emptied the contents into her palm. It wasn't gold. It wasn't a deed or a claim paper. It was a stack of letters tied with a ribbon. And on the top of the stack, in her husband's familiar, steady handwriting, was her name. Helen. Tears blurred her vision. He had left her letters, a final message. This was what the sheriff was truly after. Not the gold itself, but the proof of his crime. She was about to open the first letter when a floorboard creaked behind them. They spun around. Martha Bell stood at the far end of the aisle, her face pale and drawn in the dim light. And in her hands, she held a double-barreled shotgun, aimed directly at them. "I knew you'd come here," she said, her voice shaking but filled with a bitter hatred. "He always loved you more, even in the end." Helen stared at her, confused. "Martha? What are you doing?" "Finishing what should have been finished months ago," she said, her knuckles white on the shotgun. Samuel was a fool. He was going to share it, give away our town's future to him. She spat the word, her eyes filled with venom as she glared at Nakai. "The town deserves that gold," Martha continued, her voice rising with a frantic energy. "It's our salvation. Samuel was going to ruin everything. He wouldn't listen to reason. He wouldn't listen to me." A horrifying thought began to form in Helen's mind. She looked at Martha, at the raw jealousy and possessiveness twisting her features, and she finally understood. "You were there," Helen whispered. "You were there the night he died." Martha let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "I was the one who told the sheriff he was going to the Apache for help. I was the one who told them where to find him." She took a step closer, the shotgun unwavering. "He should have been mine. If I couldn't have him, no one could, and no one is getting that gold." So it wasn't just the sheriff. It wasn't just the town. It was a woman's scorn. A love spurned and twisted into a murderous rage. Martha had been the catalyst. She was the serpent in their garden of lies. "Give me the letters, Helen," Martha demanded. Helen clutched the letters to her chest. "No." "Then you can die right here with him," Martha sneered, and her finger tightened on the trigger. But before she could fire, the main doors of the church burst open, flooding the aisle with bright morning light. Dozens of townsfolk stood there, their faces a mixture of fear, confusion, and anger. They had heard the commotion at the sheriff's cabin. They had followed the tracks. And they had all arrived at the heart of their town to see the final, ugly truth revealed. They weren't here to help Martha. They were a jury, assembled to witness the final verdict. The town's soul was hanging in the balance, right here in this cold, silent church. And the star witness was a dead man, speaking his truth through a handful of letters clutched in his widow's hand. The crowd stood silhouetted in the doorway, their faces unreadable. Martha Bell faltered, the shotgun wavering in her hands as dozens of pairs of eyes fixed on her. The hunter had become the spectacle. "She's lying!" Martha shrieked, her voice echoing in the cavernous church. "She and the savage, they're here to steal from us. They killed the sheriff." A low murmur went through the crowd. They were a powder keg, ready to explode. All it would take was one spark. Helen knew this was her only chance. She couldn't fight Martha with force, but maybe she could fight her with the truth. Her voice rang out, clear and strong, cutting through the tension. "The sheriff was a murderer, and you," she said, locking eyes with Martha, "are the one who handed him the knife." She didn't wait for a response. With steady hands, she untied the ribbon around the letters. She pulled the top one from the stack. Samuel's handwriting was a balm to her frayed nerves. She took a deep breath and began to read. "My dearest Helen," she began, her voice gaining strength with every word. "If you are reading this, it means the worst has happened. Sheriff Harlan knows about the gold. I tried to reason with him to offer the town a share, but his greed is a sickness. He wants it all." She read on, her voice filling the silent church, painting a vivid picture of Samuel's discovery, his hopes for their future, and his growing fear of the sheriff. He described his meeting with Nakai, the pact they made, a partnership built on mutual respect. "Nakai is an honorable man, more honorable than anyone in this town, myself included," she read, her gaze flicking to the tall warrior who stood silent and watchful at her side. "I have put my trust in him, and I have put your future in his hands." A restless shuffling came from the crowd. Some faces were hardening with denial, but others were crumpling with dawning guilt. Helen took the next letter. It was shorter, the handwriting more frantic. "Harlan is coming for me. I can hear them outside. Martha was just here. She tried to convince me to cut the Apache out of the deal, to give the location only to her and the sheriff. She said she loved me. When I refused, her eyes. Helen, I saw something truly evil in her eyes. I think she betrayed me. I am going to run. I will go to Nakai's cabin. If I do not make it, this letter is my testimony. The key is the bird I carved for you. The lock is in my finest work. I love you. Do not let them take our future." Silence. A profound, heavy silence fell over the church. The truth, in Samuel's own words, had washed over them, and it was undeniable. Martha Bell's face was a ruin. The hatred had been replaced by a raw, naked panic. She looked at the faces in the crowd, saw the accusation in their eyes, and she broke. "He's lying," she screamed, her voice a ragged sob. "It was for the town. It was for all of us." No one moved. No one spoke. Her confession hung in the air, an ugly testament to her crime. Then, a man at the front of the crowd, a blacksmith Helen had known for years, slowly took off his hat. "She's right," he said, his voice thick with shame. "We all knew. We didn't know the details, but we knew Harlan had found a big strike. He promised us all a peace, said it would save the town. We chose not to ask where it came from." Another person spoke, then another. A torrent of confession and guilt poured out. They had all been complicit, seduced by the promise of easy wealth, willing to look the other way while a good man was murdered. Martha saw her support evaporate. She saw the judgment in the eyes of the people she had tried to save, the people she had damned. With a final, desperate cry, she turned the shotgun on herself. Nakai moved like lightning. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, grabbing the barrel of the gun and wrenching it upwards just as she pulled the triggers. The blast tore through the roof, showering them with dust and splinters. The shotgun clattered to the floor. Martha collapsed in a sobbing heap, her reign of hate and deceit over. Helen stood, the letters clutched in her hand, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. She looked at the people of the town, their faces streaked with tears and shame. They were not monsters. They were just weak, flawed people who had made a terrible choice. She had come to this church seeking a secret, but she had found something more. She had found a town's soul, blackened and corrupted, and had somehow, with her dead husband's words, offered it a chance at redemption. Nakai came to her side. He didn't speak, but he placed a warm, steadying hand on her back. It was a gesture of solidarity, of partnership. The townsfolk began to approach one by one. They didn't offer apologies. Words were meaningless now. Instead, the blacksmith knelt and picked up the fallen shotgun. Another man helped a weeping Martha Bell to her feet, leading her away not with anger, but with a quiet, somber pity. They were cleaning up their own mess. Helen knew it wouldn't be easy. The town had to reckon with its sins. The gold, when it was finally recovered, would not be a source of joyous wealth, but a constant, glittering reminder of the price they had paid. As the church slowly emptied, leaving only the three of them in the dust-filled silence, Elder Redbird approached. He looked at the letters in Helen's hand. "Your husband's words have healed a great wound today." Helen looked down at the pages, her tears finally falling, spotting the ink. "I thought I was worthless," she whispered. "I thought my only value was what a man could give me." "Your worth was never in question," the elder said gently. "It was simply waiting for you to claim it." She looked up at Nakai, at his scarred, stoic face, and saw a flicker of a smile in his dark eyes. He had known her worth all along. He hadn't given it to her. He had simply held up a mirror until she could see it for herself. The storm was over. The snow outside was beginning to melt under the warmth of the morning sun. A new chapter was beginning, for her and for the broken town. She was no longer Helen Carter, the poor, tragic widow. She was Helen Carter, the woman who had unearthed a town's secret and faced down its demons. And she would walk out of this church not behind a man, or in his shadow, but at his side, an equal, a partner, a survivor. In the days that followed, a quiet transformation took place. The town, humbled and shamed, began the slow, painful process of healing. The gold was eventually recovered from the claim Samuel had so cleverly hidden. By a unanimous vote, half was given to Nakai's people, fulfilling the original pact. The other half was used not to enrich the individuals, but to rebuild the town, starting with a new sheriff's office and a proper school. The wealth became a tool for atonement. Martha Bell was sent away, her fate decided by a council of elders, both from the town and from Nakai's tribe. Justice, for the first time, was a shared language. Helen did not stay in the town. She chose to live with Nakai in his small cabin, a place that had once been her prison and was now her sanctuary. The offerings that appeared on the path were different now. They were not bribes of guilt, but genuine gifts. A sack of flour, a well-made axe, a child's drawing of a hawk and a wooden bird. They were gestures of respect, of a peace that had been earned through fire and blood. One evening, as the sun set, painting the melting snow in hues of orange and pink, Helen and Nakai sat on the steps of the cabin. She had been reading Samuel's letters again, not with sorrow, but with a quiet gratitude. "He was a good man," she said softly. "He was," Nakai agreed. He took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. His touch was no longer a claim of ownership, but a simple, profound connection. "You told me once that I was worth everything to you," she said, turning to look at him. "Was that part of the bargain, too?" He was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers. "The bargain was for your safety," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The rest was the truth." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a sense of peace settling over her that she had never thought possible. For years, she had been defined by what she had lost, her husband, her status, her worth. But now, she was defined by what she had found, the truth, her own strength, and a love as solid and enduring as the mountains that watched over them. She had walked into that town a ghost, invisible and worthless. But she had walked out a woman of substance, a woman who had faced down a storm and discovered that the safest harbor was not in a town's acceptance, but in the quiet courage of her own heart. She had learned that true worth isn't something that's given to you. It's something you fight for, you bleed for, and you claim for yourself, even when the whole world tells you that you have none. And for anyone out there who has ever felt worthless, who has ever been buried under the weight of other people's judgments, remember Helen's story. Remember that your value is not determined by the whispers in the crowd, but by the strength of your own voice when you finally decide to speak the truth. If you enjoyed this story, and you want to hear more tales of justice, survival, and the strange and dark things that hide just beneath the surface, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.